Hi, everyone. I'm Winnifred Louis. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Queensland, and I want to acknowledge country before we go any further. So, with the University of Queensland, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today and that you're on, Olivia, and that the viewers are on today. And we acknowledge the ongoing connection to country, and we acknowledge elders past and present and the contributions that are made to Australian society and global society. I'm speaking today with Olivia Evans about Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, and the connection to research methods and statistics in psychology. Over to you, Olivia.
Hi. So yeah, as Winifred said, I'm Olivia Evans. I'm a Gomeroi woman. So my mob's from sort of northwestish New South Wales. Sometimes you'll hear Gomeroi said Gamilaroi or Kamilaroi. My auntie tells me to pronounce it Gomeroi, so I do what she says, but we're all the same mob. I grew up on a Wabikal land, which is in Newcastle, and I have a PhD in social psychology. My research is broadly on the social and cultural determinants of health, also looking at racism and attitudes towards Indigenous Australians. And I teach a course at the Australian National University where I'm a research fellow. I teach a course on culture and psychology, so looking at critical approaches, critical lenses on psychology, Indigenous psychology, and decolonizing psychology.
That's fantastic. I wish I could be in that course. So we're going through a series of questions today, and the first one is just where and when were you trained, and what do you remember about your research methods training, if anything?
Yeah. So I did all of my undergrad and postgrad studies at the University of Newcastle. And so that's sort of where I grew up and spent my childhood. Newcastle has an Indigenous hub called Wallatuka, and I was running through the hallways of that institute from a very young age because my auntie has worked and studied there for many years. I think the number one thing, sort of looking back now as a fully fledged, almost adult researcher, I look back and really reflect on how I was taught statistics in a very black and white way. I'm not meaning to criticize teachers of stats and methods at all, because I certainly wouldn't sign up to do that, and it must be a very difficult job. But you're taught, like, if you have this data and this methodology, then you do, if you have X data, you do Y analysis. And statistics are actually much more of a gray area and an elaborate decision making process than what it's sort of taught to you as in undergrad, or at least what I was taught in undergrad. And it's as a researcher now, it's a very rare data set where you simply like take the data you collected and run like a simple t-test or something without having to make a bunch of compromises and decisions and consult forums where people are arguing back and forth about how to handle missing data or something like that. So it's a lot more complex and nuance than what you sort of learn in especially undergrad statistics.
Yeah.
And yeah, I really enjoyed the methods courses I took as well, but I didn't really know, like I didn't get a sense from them that I liked research. It wasn't until I was in my honors year that I thought, oh, this is really cool, like getting to ask research questions and develop stuff to like answer those questions. That's when I really like took a bit of a shining to doing statistics and method stuff as a job.
Yeah, I think that's a common theme actually in the interviews. Like one of the questions that we have is what kind of research methods do you use now, if any, in your practice, research, and teaching?
Yeah, so I mainly use like regression based statistics and like survey based methodologies. So two of the big projects that I have at the moment are two like nationally representative longitudinal samples where we've asked like 3,000 Australians about a bunch of different things in one study related to their social class and their health and some different social factors. And another looking at, we collected some data just before and just after and a few months following the Voice referendum and looking at attitudes of non-Indigenous Australians. And so the methods I tend to use are that sort of survey-based, looking at mediation and moderation. How do these variables predict one another over time? How do they behave over time? How does time play into those variables as a factor and things like that? I do occasionally do some experimental research as well, but I would say largely it's very survey based.
Yeah, and those are quantitative methods as well.
Yeah.
The next question is, what would you tell students now who are having a tough time in their stats courses?
So I think I thought about this question, and I'm going to be very vulnerable and open and honest and admit that I actually failed my first ever first year stats course, like quite spectacularly. I was not even close to passing.
I
And
failed the first stats test in third year stats. I tell the students this, and I teach third year stats now.
oh, there you go. And yeah, and so I can definitely understand where students come from when they feel overwhelmed and don't understand statistics. And it wasn't like stats, like I'd never really had to apply myself in school or anything to do well in academically. And that was the first time that something just wasn't clicking and I didn't know what to do. And the next, like after that, I only ever got HDs in my stats course. But when I was thinking about it, I got it into my head, and I know that there's lots of students that do this. Like as a cohort, we all develop this thing that statistics is just like really hard and really boring, and we're never going to understand it. And that mindset really isn't helpful. So you need to first of all believe, I think, that you're going to be able to understand statistics. And I approached it almost like picking up a new language. Like I had to understand the ins and outs of it, why things are done the way that they are. And I think first year stats especially digs into this, like the foundation on which all of our methods are built. I don't remember any of that now. Like I couldn't tell you basic probability theory stuff, but I now have taken that mindset to the higher level stuff that I do.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, that's so interesting too, because you say you approached it as a language, and that's how I say too, I approach it as a language. But to me, what that meant was it's almost like you have to memorize before you understand.
Yeah.
Like you were saying just now, you have to understand. But for me, it's like when you say, like in French, like horses, cheval, there's nothing to understand. It's just you need to memorize. But then once you know that, you'll be able to understand a sentence where you hear the word cheval.
Yeah.
So for me, it was like, that's how I tell the students. It's like, there's a lot of memorizing, but once you memorize the sentence, you can translate it, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly like it's. And then I guess the thing about understanding the ins and outs is once you sort of memorize that base stuff, then you can use it to understand all of these sort of like sentences and whatever, and then you can use it to understand paragraphs. And so it's like you sort of learn the rules and then you keep building from there. But yeah, I just find I had so many students, so many of my cohort in my undergrad were just, they hated stats, they didn't want to do it, it's so difficult. A P gets a degree, had a very I'm never going to learn this locked off approach to it. And I don't, as much as we'd like to think as researchers that we're the smartest people in the world, it's not that difficult. You can if I can understand statistics, anyone can, I think.
Yeah, I feel like people can step through it. That's so important. Let's see, were there any gaps in your training?
Yeah, so I think that this is improving. So even things like this very lecture or Q&A session that we're doing is evidence of this. But in my studies, there was a real lack of diversity, Indigenous perspectives, just a general failure to acknowledge how culture and politics and things like that shape psychology, not just within, not just someone's own psychology, but have shaped how we practice psychology, how psychology functions as a science and things like that. And yeah, I think specifically within statistics and methods training, we're sort of falsely led to believe that I think that this is an identity crisis that psychology has, but we're taught that psychology is this very objective thing, that we're uncovering the capital T truth of things, and that so everything that we're doing is is a subjective, bias-free action. And what I've come to realize, and my sort of ethos as a researcher, is that we're actually telling stories, and those stories and those narratives that we're shaping with our methods and statistics are shaped by our personal backgrounds, our politics, the time that we're doing the research, who's funding the research. And it doesn't mean that they're useless or pointless or anything like that, or even that they're flawed. It's just that they aren't these sort of objective pillars that they're made out to be in undergrad. It's much more nuanced and much more shaped by culture and things like that than we are led to believe in undergrad.
I mean, I think that's such an important point. And when I think about how students are going to react to this, I know they're wrestling with the idea of when is a bad use of storytelling, like anecdotal data, the kind of stereotype of bias, and when is a good one. And I guess if I'm asking my own response, I think of it as, the bad storytelling is when you're cherry picking the data and pretending it applies to everyone and it's subjective. And the good storytelling is when you kind of understand where you're coming from and how that could impact. Is that how you see it, or how would you comment on that question about good stories and bad stories?
Yeah, well, I think that, and I think there's a question coming up about this later, but the part of the replication crisis is that for a long time we were telling bad stories because we were pretending that, we were pretending that the stuff that we do is completely free from bias or any sort of external forces on it, when realistically part of the problem is this system that we've created where you publish or perish, so you have to find significant results and you have to shape some sort of narrative, and it's got to fit in with what the publishers want to do to make money. I mean, a lot of problems come down to capitalism, really, and that's part of the problem here. But yeah, I think that in a way in psychology and possibly other disciplines, but we've lost this, the perspective that we construct the data by our methodologies, and we also have constructed the parameters and within which we assess this data. And none of this occurs within a vacuum. And so if you don't acknowledge all of that, you're going to start telling stories that you think are true, but are actually these very they're bad stories that aren't representative, that are just cherry picked, rather than what's sort of truly happening there, that suit an agenda rather than that suit what's truly happening and things like that.
Yeah, and for those that haven't heard of the replication crisis, it's this idea that sometimes if you take the studies in psychology and in other fields, and you try and do them again in your own context, they don't work. The results aren't the same. And so on the one hand, this is definitely a crisis because it comes from, in many cases, selective publication of facts that aren't universally true and are presented as though they were. In other cases, it's an invitation to think about how your context is different than the one from the original study. And so it's only a crisis if you have this real false idea that everything's universally true at all times. And if it's not, then it's not science. And that's true of things like gravity, as long as we're not in space. But it's definitely not true of relationships between attitudes and actions or so many other things. So the replication crisis, which I hope all viewers of this are studying in their courses, is real challenge to that idea, which was more common maybe 50 years ago than it is now, that psychology is a science of universals, which really empirical evidence has told us is not true.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Where are we up to? So how do you see Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing in relation to the conventional methods in psychology?
I think the main thing that I take away is the holistic approach that Indigenous peoples that we tend to have to things. And again, I think there's been some really good changes in psychology in the last 5-10 years to this more holistic approach. So I often talk in my own teaching about how in psychology we're taught this history that first of all we have the biological model of health, and then we have the biopsychological psychological model of health, and now we're at the biopsychosocial model of health, and that actually that sort of model is how Indigenous peoples have viewed health all along. In fact, even more expansive to include like community and country and things like that. And so psychology is often catching up to the methods that Indigenous peoples have been practicing for centuries. In terms of specific like methods and things like that, Indigenous knowledge systems emphasize interconnectedness. And so I think that really relates to the way that in psychology we try and sort of compartmentalize or cut off different things to look at them in like out of the context of the rest of the person or something like that. So we tend to separate like the mind and body and things like that. But Indigenous methods would view these as being deeply entwined. And I think in a sort of broader sense as well, in decolonizing psychology, we talk about taking a bricoleur approach to research, which is this sort of creating a collage almost when you do research that brings in not just the specific discipline you're looking at, but looking at the history of the thing that you're looking at and looking at the biological and psychological, and that none of these things can really exist without the other. So the more interdisciplinary, the more transdisciplinary and stuff you are, the better the approach that you're taking to understanding that. I think also storytelling. So as I mentioned, like I do think that the methods and like everything that we do in research is really comes back to we're telling stories about these things that we're looking at, and Indigenous Australian cultures are rooted in the tradition of storytelling. So how we pass on information to one another is through these stories. And so the interpretation of data, the way we present results, the conclusions that we draw are all like decision-making that we take to form this story. And that's without people knowing it, that's an Indigenous way of doing it. And I think the more aware you are of that storytelling component, the usually the better that story is that you put together, the more mindful you are of the harm that it can cause, or the benefits that are coming from it, who's it for, who's your audience, that kind of thing. And then finally, respect and reciprocity. So coming back to that idea, which actually is for a long time, psychology research was just was done often just to improve the careers of the psychologists who were conducting it. And so now things like the National Ethics Statement sort of bring in this idea of, well, who does this research benefit? How does the benefit to the community or to whoever this research is about outweigh the cost to your participants and things like that? And I think that's also a very Indigenous way of approaching things. It needs to have that reciprocity and respect element to it, that we don't just do things for our own self-interest, that it comes back and it serves a wider purpose to the community.
Yeah, that's awesome. There's some things in what you said that I don't think students at UQ will have heard of or have much exposure to, depending on what courses they took. One of them is the idea of decolonizing psychology. I know it's not necessarily an easy question, but could you talk about, maybe I have a question on this. There's a question, how are conventional psychological methods informed by whiteness and colonialism? Maybe you could speak to that a bit and then talk about the idea of decolonizing psychology.
Yep, I have notes, so I'm just going to...
Cool.
Yeah, so I think that does tie in very much with decolonizing psychology. So decolonization is a broader thing in itself. So for instance, like whole universities can say that they want to decolonize. I would also say decolonization is like a journey more so than an end point. I don't think like without sort of taking psychology or taking a university or something and burning it to the ground and starting again, I don't think you can ever fully decolonize, but it's the process of like challenging and changing and highlighting the colonial systems that keep the current status quo going. So there's some really great research out there, more like theory papers out there by Pat Dudgeon, for instance, about decolonizing psychology. And she talks about that as like psychologists, as like scientists and practitioners, psychologists, we can do things like take the brick or lure approach that I was talking about before. So have a more like a wider approach to research that takes into account things like history. So instead of just running a study that looks at for instance, like why the Voice referendum landed the way that it did, look at that from multiple different perspectives rather than, and multiple different perspectives, like why did it happen? How did it affect Indigenous peoples and all that kind of thing, rather than treating it as like a thought experiment of how how Australian politics functions or something like that. We can also decolonize psychology by introducing Indigenous knowledges and perspectives into the way that psychology is taught. And so coming back to the question, psychology as a discipline has been developed predominantly by Western white scholars who have cultural assumptions and values and things that have shaped the theories and practices. Again, I think hopefully this is getting better, but when I did my undergraduate studies from 2011 to 2014 or 15, everything that we were taught wasn't taught as if wasn't taught from the perspective of, well, this is sort of a Western, this psychology that you're being taught is from a Western perspective, is mostly, to be honest, North American. All these sort of universal truths about cognition or development or whatever is from a very specific cultural perspective. It was just taught as this is the norm. And then sometimes there was an acknowledgement that in other countries, children might develop differently or something like that. But it wasn't, it was just that this is psychology and this is the way that we do psychology, without any acknowledgement that, well, this is how a bunch of white, typically men, decided psychology is and was and will be taught in Australia. And so, yeah, psychology in Australia typically prioritizes Western norms and frameworks. So until very recently, there was very little representation of Indigenous perspectives, for instance. The methods and tools that we use are usually based on Western experiences, and they don't capture the realities of Indigenous Australians. And so there's some questions later on, I believe, about like specific like intelligence tests or even mental health, like depression and stuff, questionnaires that if an Indigenous person took them, because they're not designed for someone from an Indigenous background, might misdiagnose them because it misunderstands their lived experience, and sort of the symptoms of depression in one culture aren't necessarily the same in another. And then another thing is that Western psychology is it's treated as the norm, but also as the objective truth, and then anything else is sort of an aberration to that truth. And so we like dismiss other knowledge systems and practices as being, well, that's not the truth, or if they use different, like they might not use, like in Indigenous communities, we have knowledge systems and we have a great deal of knowledge, for instance, about like fire, how to manage the land using fire and things like that. But because it doesn't sit within, this is outside of psychology, but because it doesn't sit within a Western knowledge framework, it's just been ignored for a long time. And the evidence that we have and the like years and years of evidence that we have that approach works is just ignored because it doesn't fit in with the like statistical Western knowledge framework, even though like there's no recognition that there are other ways of compiling evidence.
And then even like you and I are speaking in English, which is a language of the colonial Australia, right? Like if there weren't that, then we would be at the Australian university, which there wouldn't have been one because universities come from the colonial kind of spread of culture, but we would be speaking in a different language, like Milroy language. So sometimes that stuff is all totally invisible.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think, like, speaking of invisibility, psychology has been a bit of a dirty word in Indigenous populations for for the last few hundred years, because psychology has been used as a tool against us, and or like mental health systems have like failed us, or in psychology, the Australian Psychological Society like actually apologized to Indigenous peoples.
Yes, 2006, an important apology that can be viewed online today.
Yeah, and that apology is for multiple things, including not standing up either, like not doing anything. And so because of that, there's a severe underrepresentation of Indigenous voices in psychology in Australia. And I think we have the Indigenous population makes up about 3 to 3.5% of the Australian population. Only about 1% of the Indigenous psychology undergraduate population, and then even lower for practicing psychologists out there. And so all of those like things is like partially because psychology hasn't been there for Indigenous peoples, and also until recently, the undergraduate curriculum, the way that we learn and practice psychology, hasn't been inclusive or accepting, or hasn't been a safe place for Indigenous peoples either, and that's only just started changing.
Yeah, great. And so I think I skipped ahead, but I'm looping back now, because after the Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, you kind of talked about this already, but the next question was, what do you think about storytelling and yarning circles as practices for research and discovery? So you've touched on these themes already, Olivia, but can you kind of revisit it for the sake of the recording?
Yeah. So I mean, it's probably pretty obvious. I'm a big fan of storytelling as the framework from which we communicate our science. And I actually don't think that there's as big of a sort of rift between quantitative approaches and things like yarning and storytelling as what people might think. And it's also like they both have their strengths.
What is a quantitative approach? Just to bring that vocab into the recording.
Yeah, so a quantitative approach would be like collecting data, so running an experiment, giving people a bunch of different survey items and things like that, and then running your like t-tests, ANOVAs, whatever. And then a qualitative approach is doing interviews, focus groups, even open-ended questions in your survey, where people basically have a voice in some way, and you're not controlling what their responses are to your questions.
Yeah.
And they both have their strengths and their weaknesses, which I think that in psychology, like there's more people doing qualitative work now, but there's not a lot of, I think, discourse I see about the fact that quantitative research has just as many problems as qualitative research. So for instance, like with sample sizes, we get like a representative sample in the hundreds or the thousands, but this comes at the cost of our participants' voices. So when you run a survey, you're essentially putting words into the mouth of your participants, and you're giving them a set of tools to respond to you, rather than letting them voice their own responses and take their answers where they would want to take them. And there's even experimental paradigms where you can actually manipulate like how salient something is to people by the way that you word those questions. So if you want them to feel good about their group memberships, you can ask them questions where they're going to respond in the affirmative. So things like, oh, I engage in most group activities. You can ask them that so that they can say yes, instead of like, I always engage in all activities, when they have to say no. And like, you can do stuff like that on purpose, but then also just as part of designing quantitative measures, we have to do that. Like we have to design questions that we think will align with how our participants are thinking, and will tell us about a certain construct that we're looking at, but we don't actually know. We're putting words into the mouths of our participants. And qualitative methods don't give us that sense of representation necessarily. So you normally have a handful to like 30 or 40 people in a interview, or you have like a handful of people in a yarning circle, but it actually lets people tell you what they're interested in their own way and in their own words, and that's almost just as important as this representativeness. So they both have their strengths and weaknesses in terms of like letting us learn something. And talking about yarning circles in particular, which is probably a bit too complicated and so definitely something I'm not an expert in, but it's where you get a group of usually Indigenous people, but there's different methodologies together, and it's a less directed form of something like a focus group, where the topic of research that you're looking in weaves in and out of the conversation as the sort of conversation and relationships develop between the researcher and the people in the focus groups and things like that. And what I really like about that idea, and what I really like about yarning circles, is that they allow for that the messiness that is like human behavior and human life. It allows for participants to talk about the topic that you're interested in within the wider web of their lived experience, and it sort of brings in that sort of wider context of the topic that you're looking at. And I also really like that it doesn't dismiss the role of the researcher in the process. So quite often in psychology, we like to think that we're sort of standing away from humanity, looking at humanity, and that's not actually true. That we are humans looking at humans, and so it's always going to be have that extra layer of complexity of trying to work out how things work. But in yarning circles, it's one of the it's part of the key interpretation is actually the researcher in that process, and their relationship with the people, and their role in interpreting the discussion and things like that. I think that's a really nice way to recognize that lack of distance that we actually have between our subjects that we study.
Yeah. And even like as we're doing the videos, like in one of the video forms, it's like we see the reviewer sees the whole conversation. And then in the other video form that we're creating, it's like the question will be there and then it's just the answers. But it's actually like that kind of hides the role of the questioner in creating the answers, you know.
Yeah.
And psychology traditionally has done that. Like we present the answers as if the question didn't have a role, but actually when you create the question, it has a huge impact on the conversation. Yeah. I think it's funny as we're talking about it, it's very meta.
Yeah.
See it, one set of viewers will see and not the other. Let's see, are there distinct research methods in Indigenous psychology?
Yeah, so I would say that yarning circles is probably the biggest one. As I mentioned, like there's not a huge number, at least in Australia, of Indigenous psychologists doing Indigenous psychology research. So I have a lot of colleagues who are in psychology adjacent disciplines, actually a lot of like people, like a lot of Indigenous former psychology students who then when they finished didn't see a place for themselves in psychology, and so now work in adjacent fields. But what they use is things like yarning circles, or even just like storytelling sort of interviews. So yarning circles, but just with one person or with an elder or something like that. Yeah. Another really important one is participatory action research. So where we collaborate with Indigenous communities throughout the research process. Hopefully students would have come across the term nothing about us without us. And so if you are doing research on, and actually it's part of the national ethics statement now, but if you're doing research on or about Indigenous peoples, it needs to involve Indigenous peoples, and there's different levels of quality of that. And so the best is participatory action research, which often involves a community organization or something actually reaching out to the researchers and then being involved at every stage of what that research looks like.
And I think like in the psychology adjacent fields, you're probably thinking of like social work and counseling, or are there other fields that come to your mind?
A lot of health based researchers, and then things like anthropology and stuff as well. But yeah, definitely social work too.
Okay, great. So I'm just having things pop up here. And then if I keep going now, one of the questions that Mark Horswell wanted to talk about for the research methods course was, do you have any examples that come to your mind of psychological tests or assessments that might be considered inappropriate or appropriate for use with individuals from First Nations communities?
So I do have, so there's quite a few different like mental health, like depression, anxiety scales that have been developed for Indigenous communities specifically. I've had a little bit of experience with this because I was involved with a bushfire recovery study after the 2019-2020 summer bushfires, and we happened to sort of just by pure luck collect a really solid sample of Indigenous people who were affected by those bushfires in this larger national study. And unfortunately, we hadn't been expecting this. And so it included the patient health questionnaire. I think it's called the PHQ-9, which is really commonly used to assess depression. And we have struggled, even like now we've published a bit of this data, but struggled a bit because that assessment measure, it can be used, it has clinical cutoffs and norms and things for the non-Indigenous population, but it's been found to be like not particularly sensitive or adequate for specific Indigenous communities and peoples. And so I've done quite a bit of looking into the PHQ-9 and its cultural validity for Indigenous peoples. And it's a lot of the research that's been done on it, they've developed specific like basically regional specific PHQ-9s. So there was one team that assessed it for, I thought I wrote down the name here, but I don't have it, but it was in the Kimberley. They took it to a community and workshopped the like linguistic and cultural properties of all the questions, and they made a number of changes to the PHQ-9 to make it more like valid and reliable for Indigenous communities in the Kimberleys. And so that included, for instance, questions that related to like suicide ideation and behavior in the PHQ-9, splitting that into multiple different questions because self-harm in non-Indigenous populations is sort of uncritically related to being part of suicide ideation, but in Indigenous cultures, and particularly in the Indigenous cultures they were working within that area, cultural cutting is like a normal, totally non-depression related practice. And so they had to separate those things out to make it actually a valid assessment of depression. And there's the PHQ-9 has a few different like cultural variations across Australia. There's also different anxiety tests and stuff it's not like if you collected the PHQ-9, you might still know something about that community if you use just the regular one with those communities, but actually like using the clinical cutoffs and the norms and stuff isn't valid. And so, yeah, you need to, it's difficult because not all of like the PHQ-9, there are these different validated cultural changes that have been made, but that's not always the case for all the different scales that we use. So you have to be, I guess, considerate and really go through and consider the way that you're using these to measure mental health, because mental health is different in Indigenous communities, and the symptoms of things like depression are different as well.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up the regional diversity, because of course it's not just non-Indigenous versus Indigenous, there's other intersectionalities as well. I mean, there's a lot to unpack in what you're saying. I think like many students might not have thought about this too much. So I just wanted something that came to my mind that might be helpful is thinking about how, like, if you imagine that crying is a symptom of depression, but actually men and women have different relationships to crying, and sometimes men are not, allowed to cry. So if you just say, have you cried in the last week? It could totally not match how depressed you are because you've been like suppressing that if you're coming from those gender norms. And also, I don't really know what cultural cutting is. Is that like, could you define that for the benefit of the readership or people that might not know it?
Yeah, so I mean, it can vary quite drastically. So it can be making certain marks on yourself for initiation. It can be part of like the grieving process to cut, but it's not for like as a way. It's not like a form of self-harm, I guess, because it's more of a form of like self-care or like a sort of a cultural practice. There's also like sometimes parts of initiation can involve like other people cutting you and things like that. And so it's just yeah, it just has a totally different cultural meaning. And it also
like
is
scarification for
yeah,
cultural
yeah.
reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not to say that Indigenous people never self-harm using cutting or things like that.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
just that sort of it has more nuance in Indigenous cultures than it might have in like the general Australian population. And so that needs to be taken into account when you administer a test that covers that.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Let's see where we're up to. What sorts of issues do clinical neuropsychologists who are testing or assessing people in First Nations communities need to be mindful of?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say I'm an expert in clinical neuropsychology by any means. I guess the general things that come to mind for me with this question is like why, like if it's research, why are we doing this research? But then more broadly, like is this the appropriate testing or assessment to be doing? How does the person or the community stand to benefit? And so in this case, like relationality strikes me as being important. As I mentioned, there's like many scars, both recent and historical, for Indigenous people from researchers, universities, the medical system, psychology. And so like if you're going to be running neuropsychological tests, that's normally quite an involved like process, and so it could bring up some of that trauma and some of those scars. And so making sure that you have a relationship with that person or that community before you do that testing. And then also I think Indigenous data sovereignty can come into play here as well. And so that's this idea or this movement about when people collect data about Indigenous people, culture, our land, whatever, who owns that data, and well, it should be that Indigenous people own that data. So how do we access it? How does it benefit us? How do we get to determine who uses it and things like that? And so there's been a lot of cases in the past of people taking Indigenous DNA and genomics and things like that and running away with them, and we don't have control of those anymore. So even like in a neuropsychology context, how do you build and maintain trust, and how do you ensure Indigenous data sovereignty over the testing or the assessment that you're collecting?
Yeah, super. Really important points. Something that comes to my mind that a couple of Indigenous people have remarked to me conversationally is that, you know, with some spiritual beliefs and kind of personal experiences, you know, the idea that like animals or trees talk to you or that your ancestors talk to you should not be seen as a sign of schizophrenia. I just wanted to put that into the recording, but I don't know if you have any comments to make about that.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a very classic example. There's some cases of that there's some videos and recordings and stuff of that in Aotearoa as well, which is that like if a young Maori man, for instance, goes into the mental health system and says he's seeing his uncle sort of appearing and telling him things, that he'd immediately be diagnosed with some sort of mental disorder and possibly like shipped off into an institution or something. But actually that's a very normal part of like grieving or about like Maori culture and things like that. And it's the same. Yeah, it comes back to those assumptions about what mental illness actually is and how it impairs functioning and things like that. And again, it's not that all Indigenous people are going to see spirits or things like that, but that seeing them and interacting with them isn't necessarily a sign of some sort of like deficit or something that's wrong.
Yeah, totally. If you were developing Oh, sorry, Emily. I've just realized that question I was supposed to not ask you.
Oh,
Oh,
no,
no,
I'm
no,
Olivia.
because you're Olivia.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's okay.
Okay, sorry, more to edit. If you were developing a psychological or behavioral test specifically designed for use with individuals from First Nation communities, what might it look like and how might it be different from traditional psychological tests? I think you've talked about some of the themes like consultation with Indigenous peoples in the development and ownership of Indigenous peoples of the data. Are there other
Yeah.
things that you wanted to stress here?
Yeah, so I think that, like, first of all, what it should look like is that it has Indigenous input into its design, and it should also have like a governance structure of Indigenous peoples governing and owning like having ownership over that data and how it's used and things like that. I think it's very context dependent what these changes might look like. So you might have to have a different focus or reorientation of the questions. So with the PHQ-9, as I mentioned, it wasn't necessarily that they took out questions about self-harm or anything like that, but it was just about splitting those questions to get a bit more information about what's going on there. In some cases, it may be about translating the questions into a different language. So for some, particularly for older generations, they may be able to better understand psychological concepts and behaviors and stuff better in their own like language rather than English. Also, Indigenous peoples have typically traditionally been visual rather than visual and oral learners rather than sort of written text. So it might be that you use art and things like that rather than text to convey like instructions and things like that. But yeah, it would vary. It's quite a broad question, so it would vary very much depending on the context in which you were doing the assessment and who you were using it on and things like that.
Yeah, and another thought in this context is, of course, like just because, as we've talked about the regional diversity, so just because a test has been developed for one group like the Maori doesn't mean that it applies to one Aboriginal community. And if it's designed for the one Aboriginal community, it doesn't mean it applies to others. Those are really principles here. Can you think of examples of situations where the use of traditional psychological tests in First Nation communities were problematic, or examples where it was helpful?
Yeah, so I've taken this reminded me of part of the first chapter of the Working Together textbook, which if the students haven't heard of, it's perfect. You could download the whole thing right now and read it front to back. So
get the link to pop up. It's the first textbook that was authored by Indigenous psychologists here in Australia, including Pat Dudgeon, who's been
and it's just coming up to its 10th anniversary, I think, this week or next week or something. So, but so they talk about the Queensland test, which was used to measure cognitive ability. And in the 1950s, they used this test on 1,000 Aboriginal children and adults. And they found that Aboriginal people fared like much worse on this test than Europeans. But that they, and so it was used to sort of prove that, Indigenous peoples have a lower cognitive ability, that we were subhuman and all those kind of things. But they also looked at the degree of contact with white Australian culture. And so the more that Indigenous peoples had contact with white Australian culture, the better they fared on this test. And they concluded from this, I think I have the name, McElwain concluded from these tests that, having contact with white culture improves your cognitive ability. And so it makes you, it's really good for you. Like we're bringing these people up in the world, but obviously, and so that's, one way that this test was misused, because clearly what we know now and what I hope most people would be able to accept is that the test was culturally biased towards European people, and the more contact that you had with European culture, the better you were at this test that tested your specifically European cultural cognitive ability.
I was saying to another person I was interviewing, Emily, about when I learned about these biases, it was because the test included items like, cup is to saucer as plate is to table. And you had to identify the analogy, right? But of course, if you don't have a cup or a saucer, or for that matter, a table, this all becomes extremely abstract and arbitrary. So
and this isn't just an Indigenous problem either. Like my mum was a primary school teacher for her whole career, and in New South Wales, to determine what reading group you went in primary school, you did this this test. I can't remember what it was called, but this reading test that started off, it had pictures and you had to identify and write what the pictures were, and then it slowly got more difficult until the end you were filling in whole sentences with what words were missing. And my mum in her lifetime as a teacher saw students start failing on the first page more and more often because there was a picture of a television, but it was a television like with the like rabbit ears and students over time started writing that it was a microwave because they'd never seen a television before. And so it, like, this test, I don't know, used to test students' reading ability, but now it was testing people's like historical knowledge of appliances in Australia.
Yeah, that's so interesting and important. So for students that don't know, televisions used to be really boxy, even though now they're like thin, like a computer monitor. So yeah, that's really, really funny to people in the older generation like me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I wanted to also just quickly throw in a positive spin on this as well. And so this isn't really a use of traditional psychology tests, but more just the use of traditional sort of psychology like measurements and things like that, or like psychology methodology. So there's more and more Indigenous sort of researchers and people in health and things like that who are using the survey methodology and using testing and things like that in a culturally appropriate way, or developing measures and tests that will be culturally appropriate for community, and using that to, like, we call them Indigenous data warriors because they're collecting data on things that we already know. So there's the Mayi Kuwayu study at the Australian National University who looks at the cultural, like looks at connection to culture as a determinant of health and well-being for Indigenous peoples. And we already know as mob that that connection to culture and being able to connect with your community and celebrate your culture and things like that is good for your well-being. But they have this like huge survey of 10,000 Indigenous people, and they're putting that knowledge that we already have into this frame of evidence that non-Indigenous people take notice of and believe in. And so using things like data and testing and psychology methods to sort of advocate for ourselves and to build evidence bases that will be accepted by the Western frameworks and things like that.
That is so fun. Could you please repeat the name of the project or the researcher?
Yeah, so it's Mayi Kuwayu, which is Mayi Kuwayu, and it's led by Ray Lovett at the Australian National University.
Okay, cool. And we'll see if we can get the links into at least the description, depending on how organized we are as a team. And that was excellent. So now there's just a couple more. Are you okay for time to run through the last set? Okay. Research shows white straight males are often presented as the default, and other groups are seen as deviations from the norm that need to be explained. Can you tell us about any examples that you might have seen of this?
So I think the stuff around IQ is pretty relevant here. So taking like norms from IQ tests that were developed by white Western men on white Western men, and then testing them on other people, including Indigenous people. And there's still actually shockingly people today taking IQ tests that were developed in Western countries and that measure what intelligence is culturally bound, and the idea of intelligence in some cases is a completely cultural artifact. But taking these tests and running them in all different countries and then concluding, like coming up with a list, like a ranking list of who the smartest countries are and who the smartest races are and things like that, which is just, I think, shocking given all that all the progress we've made in psychology so far.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, then like with that Queensland test, when we find when they found like deviances, like, oh, Indigenous people were typically like not scoring well on this test unless they'd had contact with Western European people, they interpreted that not as that, oh, maybe our test is culturally bound, but as like, oh, well, because we are the norm and we're bringing Indigenous people into the norm, we're teaching them cognitive abilities. And there's so much ethnocentrism in that, in the history of psychology, and hopefully not in its future.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, it's like so common to just not even report if you have any Indigenous folks in the sample as well. So you might run a study which has like a convenient sample for 100 psychology students. And a question, especially 10 years ago or 20 years ago, is if there's any representation of Indigenous students in that. And then there's your test, right, which is just reported as normal. And it's very easy to do that, very common to do that in my own studies. There's studies which have that, non-reporting, which was certainly normal in the old days. Yeah. And frequently you would report the gender of your sample, and you might have a psychology sample of, 80% women. This is kind of going in the other direction. Then you just would treat that as if it's normal. But actually, that's a real difference, a real distinction. So whether you're looking 40 years ago at samples of undergrads that were almost entirely men, or now, or looking at samples that are primarily, non-Indigenous Australians, and failing to report it or think about it or consider it, these are all biases that really continue today. Yeah. What have the consequences of the replication crisis been for Indigenous psychology and or First Nations people? And so maybe I'll just, start off by saying, for the benefit of viewers that are coming to this question fresh, that the replication crisis is this part when you run the same study that's been found before and you can't find the finding again. So it's a crisis in two ways. One is because it highlights that many early studies reported these false positives, often because there was a pressure to publish. So the effects weren't real and they kind of massaged the data to make them seem significant. But it's also a crisis because sometimes we have this idea that effects are universal, that should be true everywhere, but they're actually not true everywhere. They're moderated by culture. And this is only a crisis if you have this idea that effects are falsely universal. Okay, over to you, Olivia.
Yeah, well, I think bouncing off that, the replication crisis, I don't know, like I can't speak to if it's had any lingering negative impacts on Indigenous peoples or Indigenous psychology in any way. But I think actually it has highlighted to me that this idea that we aren't really, like, we're not uncovering universal truths in psychology. We're studying things within specific contexts and specific cultures and with specific groups of people and things, and that isn't always going to be replicable, but it's not meant to be, and it's not surprising that it's not. And so I learned from my psychology degree, probably the number one thing was you can't ever really know anything, but there's always gray areas and there's always nuance. And that's I think also what I've always been taught as like growing up from my family and my community is that there's like, you can't ever, if you ever try and like big note yourself and pretend that you know everything, you'll quickly get shut down, because there is always nuance to a situation. And so I think the replication crisis has actually, for some people, it made them, it's made like them go harder on, well, like, we need to pre-register. So that's where you say exactly what you're going to do, and sort of publish that in a semi-public way, or in a public way actually once you publish, but in a public way to say, well, I thought X, Y, and Z was going to happen before I ran the study, and then it is like what actually happened. So leaning really hard on that, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but also leaning really hard on like statistics having to be done a certain way and reporting having to be done a certain way. But I think the other side of things is that some people have sort of started to accept that, you know, maybe what we're doing isn't as sort of universal truth, objective science, hard science as we think it is. Maybe it is more culturally bound and context specific, and that just needs to factor into the way that we approach our science and the way that we tell the stories around our science.
Yeah, that's awesome. And let's see, are there types of graphs or data visualizations that you particularly like or dislike, and why?
I wouldn't say that I dislike any particular data visualizations. I'm definitely no graphic artist myself, but this brought to mind a specific project I've been working on with some Indigenous researchers from Yadura Walani, which is the Centre for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Wellbeing here at Australian National University. And we've been tracking Indigenous wellbeing around the voice. And so we ran some focus groups last year that sort of assessed what Indigenous people thought, what different communities thought their needs would be in terms of well-being and keeping themselves safe during the referendum. And then we've also been collecting data on different indicators of health and well-being and community connectedness and cultural connectedness and things around the referendum. And we've now sort of published about 5 or 6 reports with the Department of Health about this, how this is going. And we're finding that so what we know supports individual well-being is like community support, cultural connection, and there's a third pillar, but those kind of things. And that they were already under threat from like racism and things like that in Australia, but that the referendum has contributed to like the further erosion of those things. And so when those supports aren't there anymore, obviously well-being will be even more impacted. And we've taken the data and the like the story from those statistics, and we've been working with an Indigenous artist to represent them in like an artwork. And so we've got
Cool.
hopefully by the time this comes out we'll have published it, but it's a fish trap, and the fish trap is the individual, and it's lodged in some rocks that are the pillars and then there's like a storm, and it's really cool. You don't normally see it in psychology, but it's a really cool way to take the story of what the data is telling us and put it in like a very visual, culturally bound like way. And it's got these designs on it that mean different things. And it's probably my favorite part of like not really graph but visual representation of data that I've ever done in my career so far.
That's awesome. If it's possible to get permission to have to put it into the video, that would be really rich and cool. But if not, maybe we can at least link to where it is published, when it is published.
Yeah, well, the whole point of it is that we're now taking this stuff that's in a pretty dense, boring government report to in a way that like community and stuff can understand. So it will be publicly available. It's just we're now up to the point of like move this letter here and stuff like that. So it should hopefully be ready soon, and I can send you the link when it's out there.
Okay, awesome. That's exciting. I think that we're on to our last question, which is, do you have any advice for non-Indigenous researchers presenting Indigenous data?
I think how you got that Indigenous, like the whole story of how you got there to presenting the data is probably the most important thing, rather than how you actually present it. So as I've spoken about, the gold standard is sort of participatory action research, but you can also do research that like just involves like Indigenous, like you can consult with Indigenous people, like a land council or something can get their approval. Like there's all kinds of different ways that you can meet that requirement for doing Indigenous research. And then like how you do the research is important, and then the way that you interpret those results, if you get input from Indigenous peoples about it and things like that, and then the conclusions that you reach, that should all be at various times informed by, well, hopefully informed by Indigenous people. And then, so I think by the time you get to presenting it, it should be sort of, you should be fully in the sort of ethos of what is needed to do to present that data. I think some of the stuff I've seen, for instance, coming out about the voice from non-Indigenous people treats, so the voice referendum, there's obviously a bigger story there around, there was Indigenous people saying vote no, and then there's Indigenous people saying vote yes. But I think in general, it was a very difficult, traumatic year, and it's a very difficult, traumatic time for Indigenous peoples. And I've seen some non-Indigenous research coming out about that topic, not necessarily involving Indigenous people as survey participants or whatever, but involving this thing that had a very profound effect on us politically and socially and whatever, and treating it more as sort of a thought experiment or an interesting experiment at looking at like a political mechanism or something like that, and really separating it from the lived experience of what it was like to go through the voice, and what the outcome actually meant for most Indigenous people. As we know, most Indigenous people wanted to vote, voted yes and wanted the voice to pass. And so I think the always grounding the research in the context and grounding it in what it means to Indigenous people is important, because it wasn't just a fun thought experiment for us about, you know, how does the Australian Constitution function? It was a very real lived thing that happened to us, and research about it should reflect that. And I think that's something that is relevant to all Indigenous research that gets presented.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that was really fun convo. I don't know about you.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to say that's to the viewers before we turn the recording off?
I haven't touched on this. I've mentioned it a few times, but I hope it didn't come across this way. Like there's a lot to criticize psychology for in the past, and even in the more recent times, but it really is coming, like psychology, even from when I was an undergrad, has come a long way, not just in the way that it's taught, but in research and in practice. And it's a very positive time, I think, to be involved in psychology. And it's Pat Dudgeon said once at a conference that she's a real Pollyanna about conferences, which I'll probably have to explain to the young students now, but Pollyanna was a
super upbeat person.
Yeah, very extremely optimistic. Some would say naively optimistic sometimes, storybook character. And so, and I also, like Pat Dudgeon, am a Pollyanna about psychology. I have been very fortunate to always have people around me who have allowed me to see my space in psychology. And then since sticking around in psychology after my undergrad, I've seen that space clear out even more, that there's a lot of really good changes on the horizon. And I think as well, Indigenous perspectives can only serve to enhance the way that we do and understand psychology. It's not that we have to throw away all the things that we do. It's that bringing in different perspectives is almost always a good thing. So yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great way to finish as well. Okay.